Well, we've talked a little bit about the gap between event and gospel, and we're going to talk a little more about that. I'm going to test your memory since we just did a session on memory, and we're going to talk about orality and corporate memory some more. And I want to begin by discussing orality and three models of orality that are often brought forward in discussions related to historical Jesus. This work is tied to Kenneth Bailey, who lived as a missionary in the Middle East for a long period of time and worked with Bedouins. So he dealt with a culture that was not literate, that passed stories on, and he made some observations about how they did this that he felt were reflective of an oral culture and that could instruct us with regard to the New Testament. There are three different models that he proposed for how orality works when discussed by New Testament students. And the first is what he called informal and uncontrolled. That's your telephone game Chinese whispers approach, which basically says that there's no formal control, there's no one exercising oversight over what goes on, and it's uncontrolled. It just spins out in whatever direction it goes. And his argument is that the form critical model that is tied to Rudolf Bultmann, Carl Ludwig Schmidt, Martin Debelius, is related to this informal, uncontrolled approach, and that argues that the tradition can basically go anywhere. The second model is the exact opposite of the spectrum. It's formal and controlled. It's formal in the sense that there's apostolic oversight. It's controlled in that it's very tightly regulated. And this is the rabbinic model of what has been called the Scandinavian school. The Scandinavian school is tied to names like Gerhardsen and Riesenfeld, who originated this approach to things and used the rabbinic models of that led to the development of the Mishnah and Talmud as examples for what it is that we're talking about. Now that's important because it comes out of a Jewish setting. The problem with the formal and controlled approach, even though in many ways it's the most conservative of the three models, is that when you actually look at the Gospels themselves, you don't see the kind of word-for-word agreement that you see in some forms of Jewish rabbinic tradition. And so it doesn't produce the kind of product that you would expect a formal and controlled model to produce. So people looked at this reaction to the more open-ended original proposal of informal and uncontrolled orality and said, well, it can't be formal and controlled because the result that we see in the Gospels isn't that tight and that clean. This led Bailey to suggest the category that he proposed as being closest to the type of thing that we're seeing in the New Testament. And he called this informal and controlled. It was informal in that there weren't appointed spokespeople only who could tell the story. Anybody could tell the story. But it was controlled in the sense that there was oversight of the story. And the way he described it was this way. When stories are told in the Bedouin community, anyone can tell the story. But there are certain people, elders in the community, who know the story, and when they hear it reported by someone else, they give them some freedom in how it's told, but if they really miss the gist of the story, then they'll correct the storyteller. And in this way, the tradition remains controlled, even though the distribution of it is somewhat informal. Bailey's claim was that this is like what we see in the New Testament, that you have apostolic oversight over the story as material is moving from community to community, but anyone familiar with the story can tell it, and did so. So these are the three common models of orality that we work with, and they help us to wrestle with this idea of how much fluctuation is there as we move from event to gospel. Obviously, in the informal and uncontrolled model, the story can and does go anywhere in the way in which the material is portrayed. In the formal and controlled model, you have a very tightly controlled story with very little variation. In the informal and controlled model, you have what we actually see in the Gospels, which is the stories are told in which the gist remains stable, but the details sometimes are different. And that is said to fit the informal controlled model better than the other options. Many people have adopted this model that Bailey has put forward. Perhaps the most famous adopter is Jimmy Dunn, who wrote a book called Jesus Remembered, and emphasized orality in that presentation and worked with the model of Bailey as he did so. So that this is becoming a very popular option in discussing how orality works in the context of the New Testament. Again, using the example of modern Bedouin communities as a way of thinking about this. The challenge that sometimes comes to this model is the idea of how in the world can we use a 21st century or 20th century Bedouin model to reflect what's going on in the first century. It's a very, very fair question. It's an appropriate question to ask. But what the model does show is something in between the anything goes approach to there's no room for maneuver. And it's especially that middle place that the Gospels seem to reflect. So that's orality in the picture of three models. What comes out of this picture of orality is the idea that the gist of the story remains consistent, but it can be told with variation. And there's actually a very wonderful illustration of this within the Scripture. And I like to point to this example because it's a concrete example and we know the variables that we're dealing with when we see it. And that example is the story of Paul's conversion in Acts. Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26 are three versions of the same event. Not only are they three versions of the same event, they are three versions of the same event written by the same author. So what we see here is how the retelling of stories works in an ancient culture when we have the known control of a single author to look at. And what we see is this very clear pattern of gist with variation. There are different details in the way the story is told on each of the occasions, but the gist of the story that Jesus appeared to Saul, that he was given a commission to take the gospel to the Gentiles, is precisely the same in all three. That variation in gist makes sense because when you're retelling a story, if you simply retell it in all the same words, you end up boring the reader in some ways. But if you tell it with some variation, the variation itself introduces new ideas and develops the picture of what you have. This isn't the only event that Luke actually repeats. He goes through the telling of the story of Cornelius' conversion through Peter in Acts chapters 9, 10, and then revisits it a little bit in 15. So this idea of telling a story whose gist remains constant, but with some variation, is something that we see in a couple of places in Acts. Another important thing this kind of difference, particularly the variation, introduces is helping us to wrestle with the different ways in which stories are told as they move through the tradition. A good example of this is the centurion's servant, the healing of the centurion's servant, and the different way this is told in Matthew versus Luke. In Matthew, the impression that we get is that the centurion and Jesus have a direct conversation with one another, and Jesus heals the centurion's servant from a distance. In Luke, this is told very differently. This is Matthew 8 and Luke 7. And in Luke, it's told very differently. In Luke, we get two waves of Jewish messengers sent to represent the centurion to Jesus, and Jesus and the centurion never actually meet face to face to talk with each other. It's an interesting difference between the two. Now, some people suggest that the nature of this difference is such that Luke has added in stuff to the miracle that wasn't originally there. But the other explanation is that Luke cares about the picture of reconciliation between Jew and Gentile in a way that Matthew did not. And so he adds this detail to bring out this racial element of this healing in a way in which the healing moves forward, and the point about reconciliation can also be made alongside of it. It's an important difference, and it shows the range with which a particular event can be told. Another example of variation that we see that is very, very interesting is the stilling of the storm story and the difference between Mark and Matthew in the telling of the stilling of the storm. In the end of the stilling of the storm story in Mark, Mark issues the complaint that the disciples didn't get it, that they were hard-hearted. But in the telling of the stilling of the storm in Matthew, the account ends with the disciples worshiping Jesus as a result of his stilling the storm. Now, you could hardly have two more distinct endings to the same event. One, a harsh pointing of the finger at the disciples. The other, an appreciation for their perceiving who Jesus is. So what explains this kind of a difference? Well, again, I think if we think through the different emphases of the authors, we can get at what's going on. Mark habitually tells the story of the disciples as being slow, almost bumbling and stumbling in what they are learning about what it is that Jesus is doing and saying. In contrast to this, both Matthew and Luke tend to not repeat these kinds of harsh criticisms of the disciples. What's also interesting is that Matthew tends to portray the disciples as slowly getting it, if you will. So I think the difference that we have here is that Mark is explaining why it is that the disciples didn't get it to begin with. Why is it that they didn't immediately appreciate that Jesus could still the storm? And the answer, of course, is that they were slow to get it at the time. They didn't understand. Matthew, on the other hand, is talking about what they learned from the incident. And what they learned from the incident was the fact that Jesus had capabilities over nature that he wouldn't otherwise, that aren't normal for someone and leads them into worship. In other words, Mark is looking at the temporal angle of how they went through the event. Matthew is looking at the temporal angle of what they learned from the event. And the different temporal perspective produces the variation in the story. All this shows a kind of flexibility in orality and in the handling of historicity in the Gospels that shows that the authors are making different choices as to how they're viewing things. This is an important element in appreciating the room that the handling of orality gives the treatment of Scripture. All of this is a reflection of the way in which orality proceeded through the community. It's not done in a cavalier manner. There is a way to keep the gist of the core of the story together, and we see that in the retellings. We also get a sense of how material moved through the community by these kinds of variations that we see. It's my own view that what we have in the Gospels is a kind of, how can I say it, a kind of fixating or a kind of fossilizing, a kind of demarcation of how orality works that kind of puts it in place. So that actually, even though we're getting written texts, we're seeing how written texts were handled in an oral world by the kinds of variations that we see between parallel events. And the variations that we see in parallel events often bother people, but in fact, they oftentimes give routes into appreciating the angle that the author is actually discussing the event from, that helps us to see these events in more depth when we're sensitive to those kinds of questions. So those are some of the observations to make about the nature of orality in the Gospels. Now let's take a closer look at the issue of social corporate memory. And I've made the point already in the illustration that I used in the last section on the Challenger disaster that we're talking about central events that impacted people. The things that are being recorded in the Gospels are things that people remembered because of their impact. In fact, Jimmy Dunn, in writing his pieces on the historical Jesus, is emphasizing the fact, almost in an exaggerated way, of the way in which Jesus' portrait comes to us. It's a remembered portrait. We don't get Jesus directly. We get Jesus mediated through his impact on the disciples. And the question is sometimes raised whether that's a good thing. Sometimes people who are skeptical about Jesus will make the point, well, we actually don't have anything that goes back directly to Jesus himself, by which they mean Jesus never penned a gospel and said, the gospel of Jesus Christ by Jesus Christ. Everything that we have is mediated. It's presented to us through Matthew, through Mark, through Luke, through John. And the suggestion seems to be that the lack of autobiography somehow is a problem for the Gospels. But in fact, one could make the argument that the fact that we see 4 different portraits of Jesus coming from 4 different people who are impacted by him, almost in a kind of quadraphonic sound kind of way, actually gives us a better exposure to Jesus than if we simply had his autobiography. I like to make the point in class when we talk about this that if you think about the way instant replay works in American sports, although I don't have to say American sports, I'm very now familiar with Australian rules football. They use instant replay too. So does cricket, a very British game. So instant replays all around. And I tell you, the key to instant replay isn't that there's just one camera recording the event. The key to instant replay is there are several angles on that event, and oftentimes it's one angle in particular that really helps you to sort out the question that you're asking. So what we get in the Gospels is a kind of, and now I'm going to switch analogies, is a kind of quadraphonic sound in which each speaker that's giving us the sound is giving us another dimension of what is going on. And that variation actually adds depth to the event as opposed to leaving it flat and somehow lacking. So we're talking about central events that people remember. We're talking about memories coming at us from different angles, and those different angles fill out the picture of what it is that we're dealing with. We're also dealing with stories that are part of a network, stories that are being circulated from location to location. There's little doubt that there was some type of tradition stream that was moving from church to church and that was in circulation as you moved from place to place. So these stories are part of a network, and part of the point of the stories is their use in the context of worship, which means that they were frequently repeated stories and events that we're getting. It isn't something that you said once and forgot about it. Obviously, the Lord's Supper would have come up any time the Lord's Supper would have been talked about. Every Easter, every Resurrection Sunday, they would have remembered the story of Easter, that kind of thing. We later see the church operating on a liturgical calendar that keeps certain things constantly in front of us. So this material involves oftentimes frequently repeated events. And so their repetition, their circulation, the fact that these were things that impacted people, means that these events were wedged into collective memory in a significant kind of way that moves the ball down the road in terms of fixing the tradition and helping us to appreciate the nature of the tradition that we have. This brings us to one final theme in relationship to orality and memory and those kinds of things, and that is, what kind of historicity are we getting when we get a gospel produced through these processes of orality and memory? And the choice is sometimes portrayed this way. Do we get a digital recording? Do we get a reflective summary that's more like a portrait that you would see in an art gallery of someone? Or do we get some type of combination of both? We've already suggested that what we're getting is not pure hype, that there's some substance behind what's going on. The old picture used to be, do I have a photograph? Do I have a painted portrait? Or do I have an abstract painting? Is that how I'm getting at Jesus in terms of thinking about what the Gospels give us? And I really do think that rather than thinking about a digital recording, we aren't getting red letters all the time. What we have is a reflective summary of who Jesus is. We get a presentation of who he is and what he does, but that reflection comes with an awareness of how the story played itself out, not just the event as necessarily it was experienced at the time. Or another way to say this is, the gospel writers have a choice as to how they portray certain events. They can portray them in terms of the way they were experienced at the time with the limited knowledge that the disciples had, or they can portray the event in ways in which subsequent events and how they unfolded help us to appreciate what was going on originally. And I think the Gospels have a little bit of that refractive character built into them. That is not a violation of historicity. I like to illustrate this in a couple of ways. Most people don't know that the original name for World War I was the Great War, or the war to end all wars. That was because it couldn't have been called World War I when you went through it, because there wasn't World War II yet. There was no reason to number the world wars. Only after you get to World War II do you go back and call something World War I. But to change that label doesn't very much change the content of the events that you have, although it might impact the significance of certain events, because we know that part of the aftermath of World War I and the way in which World War I was dealt with actually set the table for World War II. So the point here is that there are ways to think about the way in which events work and have depth. Another example of the same type of thing is the famous case in a football game where momentum is changing, where one team has a big lead and the other team is kind of rallying to the cause and something happens. And we all are familiar with games where there's a fumble or a turnover that the team that's behind recovers, and the announcer says, "This could be the turning point of the game," or Mo has really changed, something like that. Well, in fact, you don't know that that's the case, even though you might sense it at the time, until the rest of the game plays itself out. That doesn't change. It doesn't change the core historicity of what happens with that event, although it does impact the way you see the significance of that event, because it takes subsequent events to appreciate all that's happening right here. When the Gospels take either a long-term frame or within the experience frame, that's an evangelist's choice, but that difference does not impact, at least in a significant way, the way we should see the historicity of those choices. It's simply a different frame of reference with regard to the event that's being chosen that impacts what's going on. So I think when we're looking at the Gospels, we're looking at this more portrait kind of category. We're not looking at a photograph, and we're not looking at an abstract painting. We're looking at this reflective portrait that portrays in a very artistic way the full features of what it is that Jesus was about. I've also suggested another category in the midst of talking about some of these examples involving differences, and that's the difference between accuracy and precision. The inspiration of Scripture and the way in which Gospels work, there can be a difference between accuracy and precision. Between parallel accounts, one account may be more precise than the other, but that doesn't mean that the less precise account is still not accurate with regard to what it's intending to communicate. The centurion servant's example is a good example of this. The messengers present who brought the message to Jesus gives a more precise account than Matthew's account that has the centurion represented as speaking directly to Jesus. By the way, how can Matthew do that and get away with it? Matthew can do that and get away with it because in the ancient world, when a commissioned representative spoke on your behalf, it was as good as you speaking. It's like what happens today in the White House when the press secretary gets up. When the press secretary gets up, we don't care that it's the press secretary who's speaking. That isn't what makes what he says important. It's because that little sign hanging over his head saying White House is staring us in the face, and we know that the press secretary is communicating a message that the president wants communicated to the public. And so he represents him in that sense of the word. Well, Matthew has simplified that by presenting what it is that the centurion asked for as personified in the authority of his request. And in that way has literally simplified the story, as Matthew often does. Matthew often tells the story in a more simplified way and in a more simplified structure than Mark tends to do. But this emphasizes this category of accuracy versus precision that we sometimes get into when we have differences between accounts. All of this helps us to understand the nature of the historicity of the text that we're dealing with and the way in which historicity works with reference to the Gospels as we're thinking about how orality works and how corporate memory works and the different angles of possibility for how things can be told in the ancient world when dealing with historical events. Well, we've sort of come to the end of, or at least we're coming towards the end of all the prolegomena that we need to go through as we talk about the Gospels. We have now to turn our attention to the sources of the Gospels that we have and the actual events that they begin to portray. And we're going to be turning that corner and going in that direction in the next session.